Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I'm joined by the Christoph, the XO. Hey, the Christoph.
It is the XO, Christoph. Hey, thanks, Dale. It's so good to be here.
So, American Revolution's done.
Thank goodness.
What do we talk about now?
I don't know. There's a lot of possibilities. We talked about the Civil War before that. I don't know. I'm pretty open.
Well, how about something with the Vietnamese?
Okay. Yes, I would like to explore that.
Okay. We're going to have a bunch of small little conflicts until we get to a bigger one, which I think the next big one is going to be the Spanish-American War. All right. So, are you ready to get underway?
Absolutely.
All right. So, we're going to talk about the bombardment of Quy Nhon. This was an attack on a U.S. Navy warship upon a Vietnamese-held fort. The commander, a guy named Nhon, was serving with the East Indian Squadron in June of 1861.
Oh.
And just before setting sail, East joined the West Gulf Blockading Squadron. His last mission in the Far East was to proceed with the paddle steamer sloop, the USS Saginaw, to Quy Nhon. This boat was filled with sailors from the American merchant ship Myrtle. And this boat was reported missing. So the flag officer, a guy named Frederick K. Engel, ordered him to search the area. The Saginaw was armed with one 50-pound gun and one 32-pound gun, and also two 24-pound rifled guns.
Yeah, it does help.
She had a complement of 50 officers and enlisted men. Now, when the commander arrived off of Quy Nhon in July, he prepared to enter the harbor the next day at 0100. He wanted to ask the Vietnamese if they had seen the missing sailors. So when they entered the harbor on July 31st, the nearby fort to the north, that had a few guns, opened fire at a range of 600 yards. The crew was just putting the anchor down when the first shot burst in the water next to them. Now, as you can imagine, they were quite surprised. At first, They raised a white flag to show that they had friendly intentions, but then a second and then third shot were fired.
Oh, man.
So, they built up their steam again, because this was a steamboat. They turned around and slowly withdrew to 900 yards, by which time they were at general quarters. They returned fire with one of their 32-pounders, and after about 20 minutes, the Vietnamese guns were silenced.
Wow.
A secondary explosion was observed, and it was suspected that either the powder magazine or one of the guns blew. After the explosion, no further shots were fired from the fort. But the Americans, they were like, we're just going to keep going. And they continued their bombardment for another half hour.
Dude.
Until the fort was in ruins. There were no American casualties or damage. And after they found that communicating with the Vietnamese was not going to happen, they steamed to Hong Kong. They ended up not finding the missing American sailors, but they, did win this unprovoked battle.
Yeah. It seems not wise to bombard a warship, especially, I mean, the time frame is weird to me, too. This is, you said 61, right?
This was 1861, yes.
So in 1961, I think we had not committed U.S. troops to the Vietnam conflict to help the South Vietnamese, but the war was still, I think it started in the 50s for them.
Again, this is 18.
Oh, 1861.
1961.
Huh.
Yeah, we're not in the 1900s yet, buddy.
Sorry, I just think Vietnam, I think That's wild. Okay. Well then, yeah, no comment.
Any parting words?
Um,
Because we're done with this one.
well, I think I've heard the advice that when you encounter a policeman, for example, don't consider them a policeman, consider them a guy with a gun. And so act accordingly. Don't provoke.
Antagonize
Yeah,
them?
exactly. And I kind of have that same mentality here. It's like, hey, we're a fort and we see this giant ship. Let's not provoke, because then your fort could be in ruins. But yeah, I think that's exercise wisdom and caution. I think that's the lesson here.
Okay. I'll accept that. All right, so we're going to go to 1860 and 64. This is the Shimnosaki campaign. This was between one of the Japanese, what were they called back then? Because back then the Japanese were in clans. They were not united.
Oh, right.
So this was with the Choshu domain against the U.S., the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the French Empire, and the British Empire. So the Tokugawa shogunate were trying to establish an atmosphere of peaceful solidarity. But many feudal daimyos were very resentful of the shogunate's open door policy to foreign trade. Because remember, back in this time, Japan was very isolated. They did not want outside influence, right?
Right. I think, but this is just, you said this was 63-ish, 1863?
Yes.
Right, yes. I see, I clarified this time. Yeah, just 10 years earlier. That's when they were forced to trade because of Commodore Perry saying, hey, we've got these ships, we would really like to trade with you. And they were realizing how remarkably far behind they were technologically.
Yes, we actually have an episode on all of that.
Oh. Well, I'm glad I could help segue to that, to push listeners to that episode.
Yeah, I believe during this time there was only trade allowed with the Dutch in this one island where all the foreign trade was done with. And then, yeah, Perry was like, no, I'm going right up into mainland Japan.
Right.
But anyway, you want to hear more about that? Go back to that episode.
There we go.
So, there was the opposition to the European-American influence erupted into open conflict when the Emperor Komi, who broke with centuries of imperial tradition, began taking an active role in matters of state, and issued on March 11th and April 11th of 1863 his order to expel barbarians.
That's us.
Yes. The Choshu clan under the daimyo Mori began to take action to expel all foreigners after the deadline on the 10th day of the 5th month of the traditional Japanese calendar. He openly defied the shogunate. He ordered his forces to fire without warning on all foreign ships traversing the Shimnosaki Strait. This is a strategic and treacherous 600-meter waterway that separates the islands of Honshu and Kyushu. And this provides a passage connecting the inland sea with the Sea of Japan. So this is an important strait.
Yeah.
Even before the tensions escalated in the strait, foreign diplomats and military experts, notably the U.S. Minister to Japan, Robert Pryan, and the U.S. Navy Captain Donald McDougal, had been aware of the precarious state of affairs in Japan. McDougal wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Navy, a guy named Gideon Wells, stating, quote, "General opinion is that the government of Japan is on the eve of revolution. the principal object of which is the expulsion of foreigners. So the Choshu clan was equipped with mostly antiquated cannons, firing cannonballs. They did have some modern armament, such as 5 8-inch Dahlgren guns, which had actually been given to them by the United States.
Huh.
They also had 3 steam warships of American construction. The bark Daniel Webster, which had 6 guns, the brig Lanrick, or Kossi, with 10 guns, and the steamer Lancefield, or renamed Koshin, with 4 guns. So the first attack occurred on June 25th of 1863, just after the order to expel barbarians came into effect. The U.S. merchant steamer SS Pembroke, under Captain Simon Cooper, was anchored outside this strait when he was intercepted and fired upon by 2 European-built warships belonging to the Japanese rebel forces. The crew of one of the enemy vessels taunted the very frightened American seamen with a loud and unnerving cry. Quote, "Revere the emperor and expel the barbarians." But, either way, it's going to be terrifying.
Yes.
So they came under heavy cannon fire, and Pembroke managed to get underway and escape through the Bungo Strait, which was right next door. They had very little damage and no casualties. So when Cooper gets to Shanghai, he files a report of the attack and sent it to the U.S. consulate in Yokohama in Japan. The next day, the French naval dispatch steamer, the Qin Shan, was also anchored outside the strait when, again, the rebel Japanese artillery opened fire, this time on the bluffs surrounding the strait. The Qin Shan sustained damage to its engine and suffered 4 casualties before it was able to get underway to the ocean.
Whoa.
On July 11th, despite warnings from the crew of the French vessel, the 16-gun Dutch warship, the Medusa, cruised into the strait. Her skipper was Captain Francois de Cassembrut, and he was convinced that the Japanese forces would not dare fire on his vessel due to how big and bad it was. And, of course, the long-standing relationship between the Netherlands and Japan.
Right.
Because, they were the very first trading partners that they actually accepted. Freely accepted, not by gunpoint.
Exactly.
But, they got fired.
Whoa.
They got hit with more than 30 shells, killing or wounding 9 sailors. They returned to fire and ran the quote-unquote rebel gauntlet at full speed. They were very, very afraid that the Dutch consul general who was on board was going to get hurt. So, within a very short amount of time, the Japanese warlord had managed to fire on the flags of most of the nations that had a relationship with Japan. So this brings us to the morning of July 16th. In a response to the attack on the Pembroke, the U.S. frigate USS Wyoming, who was captained by McDougal, sailed into the strait and single-handedly engaged the U.S.-built fleet that the Japanese had. Thankfully, they were poorly manned. They, didn't have the manpower they needed to have to use those boats. And they engaged with them for almost 2 hours before withdrawing. They sank 2 of the Japanese vessels and severely damaged a 3rd one, and inflicted about 40 casualties onto the Japanese. Now, the Wyoming did suffer extensive damage. They also had 4 killed in action and 7 wounded. One of them did pass later. The 2 steamers that were sunk by the Wyoming were raised again in 64, and they were brought to the harbor to be fixed.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
That's impressive.
So after that battle on July 20th, the French Navy retaliated for the attack on their merchant ship. Their force consisted of Marines and 2 warships.
Ooh.
They were the Aviso Tancredi and the flagship of the Admiral, the Sierra Maris. So with 250 men under Captain Juarez, they swept into the strait and destroyed a small town.
Wow.
And 1 artillery placement.
Whew.
This attack was supported by the French plenipotentiary in Japan, a guy named Dachine de Bellecourt. But the French government was like, that's not cool.
Really?
Yes. They actually criticized their representatives in Japan because they had much more important military commitments to honor.
Oh, I see.
In other parts of the world.
Yeah, this is...
And, yeah, so a conflict in Japan was really not on the plate right now.
Well, they started it.
They sure did. At least this...
Yes. It wasn't Japan proper.
Yeah. But the Shogun actually congratulated the Admiral for taking the decisive steps that he took.
Oh, yeah.
And was awarded a special banner.
Really? Well, that's saying something.
So while this was happening, the Americans, French, British, and Dutch did open diplomatic channels to try to negotiate the reopening of the passage. Months dragged by. And by May, various Japanese factions had destroyed thousands of dollars in foreign property.
Ooh, and that's 1860 dollars. It's a lot.
Yeah, this included homes, churches, and shipping areas. So throughout the first half of 1864, the strait remained closed to foreign shipping. Threats and rumors of war hung in the air.
Yeah, I could see that. It's one faction, and you're being congratulated by the officials in Japan, so it doesn't sound anywhere near like an actual state versus state conflict.
Because of how fractured the clan system that they had going on was at this time.
Although I guess it could be viewed, because the people in the West may not know that, like the French, British, etc. So,
oh no, they knew that.
Oh, did they? Okay.
Oh yeah.
Then it's all good, because had they not known that, they would have seen that as a unified repulsion on behalf of the entire nation, and so they would have acted accordingly.
Yeah, no, they were fully aware that one faction was attacking them while the main shogun, who was, quote-unquote, the prime minister of the Japanese home islands, were 2 different entities.
I could see that. It's very tumultuous. I don't know what else to say about it. Just, I would be similar to if somebody came to the Americas during the Civil War, and, I mean, clearly there are 2 distinct sides, and I guess 2 distinct nations, really, but they could view the acts of one as the acts of both. You know what I mean? And so that wouldn't have been fair. And likewise, that's kind of the only parallel my American mind can grasp onto.
Well, I would think that there was a group of people who thought that during that time. And that would have been the Native Americans.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yes.
Because all of them were invaders.
Right. And they had the same attitudes towards them regardless of North or South. Or I guess United versus Confederate States.
Yeah. Even though plenty of tribes did engage with one side or the other, they're all invaders. They're just trying to not be wiped out at that point.
Right, yes. That's a good point.
So the British minister to Japan, a guy named Sir Rutherford Alcock, he discussed with his counterparts, like the American minister Robert Pryon, the feasibility of a joint military strike against Takachika. And they started preparing for a combined show of force. 15 British ships anchored alongside 4 Dutch vessels, and a British regiment from Hong Kong augmented their display of military force. The French maintained a minimal naval presence, with most of their forces in Mexico, trying to help Emperor Maximilian with his regime over there. The U.S. is engaged in a civil war, so this limited their demonstration of military force for this conflict. And while this is happening, the rebel forces under Takachika limited itself to demonstrate diplomatic and minimal military support for the Allies by requesting additional time to respond to their demands. And this was not acceptable to the Allies. So the Allies decided that it's time to go and get it. In July of 1964, the rebel forces did fire upon the U.S. steamer Monitor after she entered the harbor for coal and water. This provoked further outrage, even after a British squadron delivered a multinational ultimatum to them, threatening military force if the strait was not opened. So in August, a squadron consisting of 9 British, 4 Dutch, and 3 French warships, with 2,000 soldiers, marines, and sailors, under the command of Admiral Sir Augustus Leopold Cooper of the Royal Navy, steamed out of Yokohama to open the strait.
Wow.
The U.S. sent a chartered steamer.
We're in it. It's like this gift is from both of us.
A 2-day battle ensues.
Wow.
This was September 5th and 6th. And they destroyed the Shoshu domain's ability to wage war on the Western powers. They were just not able to match the firepower of an international fleet.
Yeah, no kidding.
And so, after a lot of casualties, they finally surrendered on September 8th. The Allied casualty count was 72 killed or wounded, and 2 severely damaged British ships.
So, whenever there's an international effort like this, British, French, Dutch, they don't speak...
And American.
Oh, yeah,
Americans
okay.
were there.
We'll pull Americans in there. But the reason I focus on the first 3 were they speak different languages. And so when you have military men of nations of different nationalities that speak different languages, how is that coordinated? My first question is that. The second is there like some kind of standard language? For example, today they have, with airlines, English is spoken by all traffic control towers, and so pilots have to have some kind of minimal understanding of English to communicate. How was this handled in the Navy? And was that the case in the mid-1800s? I guess today would be different, just because the British and American naval expression of power on the sea has been so dominant for so long that English kind of becomes a de facto way of communicating.
Mm-hmm.
But at this time, I'm just curious.
So I'm pretty sure because of the dominance that the English had on the world at that time, English was still the trade language.
Okay.
Just like it pretty much is today.
Fascinating. That's cool.
So, especially in the higher ranks, in the 1800s, a lot of these people were
Yeah, it's true.
They spoke multiple languages, and English would certainly be one of them.
Mm-hmm.
But even if you had, Admiral the Stupid didn't speak anything but French, he would have a translator with him.
That makes sense. Okay, yeah. I keep forgetting about, especially, like you said, higher echelon or status people, not necessarily aristocracy, but equivalent nobility or whatever, would be trained in other languages.
And even if they weren't, there were always people, just like now, who are trained in multiple languages.
That's true. Okay, that makes sense.
I mean, look at the UN. They got all those headsets on because they have translators in their ears translating what everybody's saying.
That's a good point. Okay, yeah, I guess you could just put one of those on a boat, and there you are. Right.
Having the guy whispering in their ear, but yeah.
It's like, tell them to stop shooting. What's the word for shoot?
No more pew-pew.
That's right. But I imagine also, like, there's another level with inter-ship communication with the flag system. Is that a standard across different languages, or how does that work?
Now it is standard across, the international sailing.
Mm-hmm.
Semaphore is a standardized language.
Okay, cool.
It was, whatever your country did.
Yeah, I could see that. But I'm sure there were some common, like white flag, red flag, things like that.
Well, white flag definitely. Lowering your colors typically meant surrender.
And then black, what is it, skull and crossbones, take no prisoners type of thing?
Skull and crossbones, pirate.
Well, I thought that was indicative of, I don't know if it's just black flag or with the skull and crossbones, but it means we're not capturing anybody, we're killing everybody. And pirates did that because that was their go-to, but I may be misunderstanding that.
I don't know, maybe. I think red would signify that there's disease on board. Stay away.
Oh, nice. That's a good flag to have.
All right. So there was an accord drawn up after a ceasefire that was negotiated by the U.S. minister, which included a indemnity of $3 million from the Japanese.
Oof.
At this time, this was the equivalent to a cost of about 30 steamships.
I think that's what we bought the territory of Louisiana for.
The Tokugawa shogunate was not able to pay such a vast amount. And this failure became the basis of further foreign pressure to open Japanese ports. They had to choose between paying compensation of 3 million piastres and opening another port on the inland sea. Yeah, it's a coin. It's a type of monies.
That's cool. I've never heard that before.
Let's see. So the harbor of Hyogo was open to foreign trade, and custom tariffs were lowered to 5%.
Wow.
In 1883, 20 years after the first battle to reopen the strait, the United States quietly returned $750,000 to Japan.
That's cool.
So right after, mentioned, the shogunal government also launched its own plans for a punitive expedition against the Choshu.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this was the first Choshu expedition. It was aimed at punishing the 1864 Kinmon incident, in which the Choshu forces attacked shogunal forces in Kyoto. But this was canceled after a compromise was brokered.
Oh, that's... Whoa, that's what they compromised on.
Yep.
Oh, you got to start pretty bold to have that be where you end up. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. the whole significance of all of this, the troubles in Japan at this time seemed to exemplify their gunboat diplomacy, which, is a really big tool that imperialism governments use.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
The bitter resentment against foreign influence made the Choshu clan feel justified in engaging in, the only way to put it is, foolish acts of military provocation in defiance of their own government.
Did they learn nothing from the Vietnamese fort we just talked about?
I don't know if they would have even heard of that.
No, I doubt it.
So the same nationalistic anger directed against foreigners would flare up later in the Chinese Boxer Rebellion. The U.S. and its European allies then felt compelled to use military forces to uphold the treaty with Japan. While the Civil War was going on, President Lincoln's government would actually carefully watch the world for signs of weakness and indecision. The actions of the USS Wyoming made it the first foreign warship to offensively uphold treaty rights with Japan.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this, coupled with the possibility that the events would mire the U.S. in a foreign war, made the battle a significant engagement.
I could see that, yeah. If you're in the middle of your own civil war, the last thing you want is to have to split your forces to deal with something else.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that is the Shimnosaki campaign.
That sounds right.
So, any final thoughts before we move on?
Provocation seems like a bad idea. So, I am wondering if they had... I'm thinking of it through the current context in my mind, and I know there's a lot of different countries that have different rules on immigration. Some are very strict, some are very loose. It seems like there was one faction that was wanting to be very strict, but I don't know what their motivations were beyond that. That seems like a very high-level view of what they were seeking. I don't know if they were like, hey, there's too much change too quickly. Japan was doing all right. We don't need all this other stuff. I don't know. I wonder what would have been different had they kept up technologically with the West. They may have been able to repel the European powers and Americans, and then it would be a very different story. But I guess it just...
Possibly.
Yeah.
But the Japanese never had the advantage of resources that the Western powers have always had.
Right. That's true. I guess you don't really start seeing that until they make imperial moves, circa World War I-ish.
They start taking territories where the resources are.
Exactly. So,
yeah,
I agree.
All right, so we're going to move on to the Formosa expedition. This was between the U.S. and Taiwan.
Oh.
So on March 12th of 1867, the U.S. merchantman Rover was sailing off Ulanpi, Formosa, when she was wrecked on an uncharted reef and began drifting out to sea. Her crew of over 24 safely made it to shore and were attacked and killed by the Pauwinians. A Royal Navy ship, the HMS Cormorant, discovered the fate of the rover and told the American East Indian Station. So the squadron commander, Rear Admiral Henry H. Bell, ordered Commander John C. Febinger in a newly commissioned gunboat, the USS Ashuelot, to proceed from Foochow to the island to investigate the incident.
Nope. Just let's get the facts in order. I think that's a good move. Let's see if there's any provocation.
So once they get there, the Qing authorities assured Commander Febinger that the attack was carried out by warriors of a village that did not practice respect to the nation's laws. So with this information, the Ashuelot returns and notifies Rear Admiral Bell. So at this point, diplomatic pressure did not work. So, as they typically did during this time, the punitive expedition was decided on.
I see.
At least they tried the diplomatic way first.
Yeah. Well, they did find out that it's effectively a group of rebels, at least in the eyes of the current government. It's like, hey, they just kind of do their thing. They don't even respect our laws. So that kind of gave
Yeah,
them
but when does that ever matter?
well, I think what that did is it justified a green light. It's like, all right, well, we got to teach them a lesson.
Green light would have been cast either way.
That's true. I guess it's hard for me to think in those terms in that time period. But yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, no matter what, if they didn't get what they wanted, which is typically, a apology and reparations, they're coming in guns blazing.
Yep. Justice will happen one way or another.
So Bell, he takes the sloop of war USS Wyoming and his flagship, the USS Hartford, and leaves Shanghai in June for southern Formosa. Of course, the voyage was uneventful, and they arrive off the southeastern coast on June 13th of 1867. And they anchor a half-mile offshore and made preparations for a landing. A total of 181 officers, sailors, and Marines were landed by boat. They were commanded by Commander George E. Belknap of the USS Hartford, and his XOs were Lieutenant Commander Alexander Slidell Mackenzie. Upon landing, they broke up into two forces. Belknap commanded one of the forces and Mackenzie the other. The Marines were led by Captain James Forney. 20 of these were deployed as skirmishers in front of the columns.
Okay.
Their objective was to defeat the Aboriginals decisively and to capture their village. Now, Formosa, if you've never been there, is a tropical island. It's hot and humid in the summer, and mountainous jungles on the east and plains in the west. This made the march very difficult.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
They wore heavy uniforms designed for keeping men warm while at sea. So they march, and about an hour into their march, the Formosians attack them with muskets from concealed positions on top of a hill directly in front of them. They were very difficult to see, and the expedition later reported that the Formosan warriors wore colorful face paint and were armed with spears and some firearms. So Lieutenant Mackenzie's force engaged first by immediately charging the ambush. But the natives fled before they had time to climb the hill. So they formed back up and started marching again. And were once more ambushed. The Americans again charged and captured the position, but the enemy had already fled. There's been no losses to the Formosians yet. As they continue marching to the village, they were ambushed several more times.
Golly.
There have been no casualties whatsoever on either side.
Oh, I'm surprised.
Yeah. It was actually not until the last ambush that the first and only American casualty was sustained. The warriors fired a volley, and a musket ball hit Lieutenant Mackenzie, mortally wounding him. After this volley, they again retreated. But this time the Americans were like, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times, shame on me.
Yep.
And they did not pursue them.
Smart.
Yeah. So by this time, 6 hours of marching has happened.
In heavy coats, in hot weather.
Several men had either grown delirious or passed out because of the gear they were wearing and the heat that they were experiencing. So when they get back to shore, they re-embarked their ships and sailed back to China.
So what was the purpose of that?
Well, to punish them, which they failed in doing.
Okay, that's kind of what I got out of that. I'm like, ooh, that didn't seem to serve very much at all.
We don't know if there was any casualties on the Formosan side because no bodies were ever found by any of the Americans. So if any casualties were sustained by them, they took them with them when they fled.
Makes sense. Wow.
So after this expedition returned to China, the American diplomat, a guy named Charles William Legrand, who persuaded the Governor General Liu of Fuchao to send his own expedition. He also requested that Rear Admiral Bell send a gunboat in support of the operation, but the admiral was like, no.
We just tried that. It did not work out so well.
So Legrand takes command of the Chinese troops and leaves Fuchao for southern Formosa on July 25th of 1867. This expedition was peaceful, and after landing and marching to the tribal capital, Lagrange negotiated a treaty with Chief Tukatuk. The treaty was meant to assure the safe conduct of shipwrecked sailors throughout the Pauwanian chiefdom.
Nice.
Unfortunately, attacks on wrecked merchant ships by Formosian natives did continue. One resulted in the Taiwan expedition of 1870, which the Japanese military campaigned against them. This was after 54 Nhon and Japanese sailors were captured and beheaded at the southeastern tip of Formosa.
Wow.
The Japanese did succeed in engaging the Pauwanian warriors in battle and received compensation from the Qing government for the massacre. From late 67 to 68, Bell was appointed commander of the new Atlantic Squadron. No, the new Asiatic Squadron. And while supporting the opening of Japan, he anchored off Osaka to increase pressure on the Japanese government to open Hyogo. In January, he was paddling to shore and his boat capsized. And all but 3 of the occupants drowned, including the rear admiral.
Ooh.
All right, so what do you think of the Formosa expedition?
Interesting, because I know, like, I barely remember Formosa, because I was thinking it was like Barbosa, and it's like, no, it's like Taiwan. I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, well, it was Taiwan. The island of Taiwan now was Formosa then. And I went, oh, okay. And I just think it's so interesting that China viewed them as a rebellious place where they don't follow the laws, and in a different manifestation, that's still kind of the case. You have a communist Chinese country saying, oh, that breakaway republic over there, or... yeah, they're officially with us, but they're kind of rebellious, and it's just this détente that they have. Whereas Taiwan is like, no, we're our own thing.
And we have the background, U.S.
Right. So they probably treat shipwrecked sailors better nowadays, but I just think that the parallels are better.
At least ours.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's interesting. And when you mention also the years, I think it's so... I didn't know that America projected its power on the seas so internationally, even in the 1860s. Like, that seems like it's taking away from battles that could be being fought at home, really. I mean, you've got a civil war happening, and I know we had discussed that, and kind of... I know the Union forces were very dominant from a naval perspective, but... even with that dominance, they still had ships to send out to Japan or India or stationed in all number of places. I thought that's really interesting.
Yeah, no. Once the U.S. broke with England, they took to international diplomacy and everything really, really quickly.
Oh, yes. That's...
I mean, even during the Revolutionary War, they opened up consulates and sent dignitaries to other countries.
Yeah. And that probably played a major role in their recognizing the United States as a country, like France, Netherlands, Spain, things like that.
It happened very slowly as they were watching how the war was playing out. But that is going to bring us to the end, where we honor one of our fallen angels with the help HeroCards.us. So today we're going to honor Ensign Dwight C. Engel. His hometown was Lamar, Colorado. He served with the U.S. Navy Patrol Squadron VP-22. He received a Purple Heart. His date of sacrifice was January 18th, 1953, off the Formosa Strait off Swatow, China. He was 24 years old. Dwight Clark was born on August 17th, 1928, and grew up in central Colorado along with his twin brother Otis Jr. and his sister Barbara Ann. He graduated from South Denver High School, then studied civil engineering at Colorado A&M College, which is now Colorado State University. He was a member of the A&M Athletic Club and joined Sigma Alpha fraternity before completing his degree in 1950. In August of that year, he enlisted in the United States Navy and went through Air Cadet training, earning his wings and his commission at Pensacola Naval Air Station on Florida's Gulf Coast in April of 1952. A month later, he eloped with Miss Jerry Britton, whom he met at Colorado A&M, and the couple moved to Hawaii, where Dwight was assigned. His next assignment was in Japan. Jerry was diagnosed with polio and returned to stay with her family in Denver.
Oh.
Yeah, polio. This was the big polio thing.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, that's...
Yeah. My grandmother suffered from
I'm sorry.
polio. On January 20th, 1953, Jerry received a telegram from the U.S. Navy, one that all military families dread. Her husband has been missing for 2 days. Ensign Engel, with his patrol Squadron 22, was one of 13 crew members aboard a P-2V Neptune patrol bomber based in Okinawa, Japan. The plane took off from Naval Air Facility at Tsugi, Japan, on a shipping surveillance mission in the China Sea. Flying near the China coast in the Formosa Straits, later Taiwan Straits, their P-2V was hit by enemy anti-aircraft fire. The plane was struck behind the cockpit on the port beam. Its port engine and wing were on fire, forcing an emergency water landing. The aircraft slammed into the sea 15 minutes after being hit. Despite 15-foot swells and 30 wind knots, all 13 crew members managed to escape the sinking plane, and an SOS was sent. They had one burned and partially inflatable life raft, and so the crew members clung on to the sides in the frigid waters, hoping their SOS had been received. After 5 hours, help arrived in the form of Lieutenant John Vulick flying a USCG PBM-5G Mariner. The Coast Guard Air Detachment of the U.S. Naval Station Sangley Point received words that a Navy aircraft had gone down and scrambled for a rescue mission. With night falling and sea swells increasing, officials at Sangley Point left the no-go decision to Lieutenant Volk. Putting himself and his crew at enormous risk, Volk chose to land the plane. Skillfully setting the aircraft down on rough seas, Lieutenant Volk maneuvered close enough to pick up the Neptune survivors. With conditions worsening, the rescue plane attempted to take off when the starboard engine suddenly quit. Its right wing was caught by an ocean swell, which flooded into the aircraft, turning the plane vertically and caused it to cartwheel. 5 of the Coast Guard rescuers and 4 of the rescued sailors died in the crash. Survivors huddled in 2 life rafts, and rescue ships, including destroyer USS Hazley Powell, DD, were dispatched. After a long ordeal in enemy waters, 10 survivors were pulled to safety aboard the Hazley Powell. 7 of them had survived 2 plane crashes in one day. Dwight C. Engel was not among the survivors and was declared missing in action, lost at sea on January 18, 1953. He was listed as presumed dead a year later on January 19, 1954. Some newspaper accounts in 1955, including the Asheville Citizen-Times, insist Ensign Engel survived the crash and was taken prisoner in China. Quote, according to the State Department's report to Republican McCormick, the Americans definitely known to be in the communists' hands include the following: Navy, Ensign Dwight C. Engel. Whether Lieutenant Dwight Engel survived the second plane crash off the coast of China may never be known. After being declared presumed dead, Lieutenant Engel has been added to the list of heroes lost in what is often referred to as the Forgotten War, which is the Korean War. Jerry Engel eventually remarried and has 2 daughters. So, Ensign Dwight C. Engel, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, XO, take us out.
Sure. So first, thank you so much for listening to this podcast. We know you have many choices in the podcast arena, and we're so grateful that you're spending time with us. If you ever want to get a hold of us, let us know how we're doing or request or what have you. We'll do the best we can. You can do that in a couple different ways. Number one, you can email us at usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Secondly, we're on X, formerly Twitter, with the handle at USNHistoryPod. And then we also have a Discord that you can join. The link is in the show notes. So if you join us there, you can interact with us and other listeners as well. Finally, please rate and review us, iTunes, YouTube. That really helps us get the word out of what we're doing, what we're trying to do, and gets us to other ears. And you can tell a friend, tell a family member. We'd love to have them too. Also, we do have an option for subscribers. If you want to support us financially, you certainly can. We have some bonus episodes that are exclusive to subscribers. For details on that, please investigate the show notes also. I think that's everything. Dale, did I miss anything?
Well, if you did, we will punish you later.
Okay, yes, that seems appropriate in this military podcast. I'm sure it'll be a demerit or two, I hope. Maybe suspend shore leave, which would not be great, but I understand.
Keel hauling.
Oh, hopefully not. Hopefully the mistake was not that major, but I would not forget if you did that.
All right, so we're going to wish you all fair winds in the following season.